Okay, let's start. Good evening, everybody. I'm Brendan Donnelly. I'm the director of the Federal Trust. Thank you very much for joining us. We've a very interesting webinar planned for this evening, which will be a presentation by Martyn Bond of the life, times, and opinions of Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, a very important figure in the early history and middle history of European integration. Martyn lived a varied and interesting life. In 1981, he was the British BBC correspondent in Berlin. He then went to the Secretariat of the Council, where he was responsible for relations with Parliament. And for many years in the 1990s, he was the representative of the European Parliament here in London. And I'm very pleased to say that more after that, he became my predecessor as director of the Federal Trust. I've gone through Martyn's qualifications in ascending order of eminence and prestige. Thank you very much indeed for Martyn for joining us. You've written a very interesting book. Those people who haven't yet read it certainly should want to. And I'm sure many of them will want to after having heard you this evening, because you're going to start with a presentation of this interesting and controversial man's life, and for some controversial man's life, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and comments afterwards. Martyn, welcome and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed, Brendan. I'm going to slip onto screen share because I have a PowerPoint presentation with some illustrations from his life, so bear with me one moment while I just do that. There we are. Very nearly there. And
apologies for the bad language, by the way. There isn't any more of it, I don't think, later.
Let me see if I've just got the right point here. Slideshare from beginning. There, just coming. There, I think we can start on that. I just want to run through about a dozen short slides, will take about the same number of minutes, in order to give us common ground about his life and points from which we can then talk about his opinions and the suitability or non-suitability of some of his ideas for the current debate about Europe. It's a dramatic life and it covers pretty well the first half of the 20th century. He died prompt some further thoughts about the future of Europe. So let us move to the next slide here. This is our publisher's slide, but before I launch right into the story of the man, I would like to thank 3 or 4 people who I know are in the audience. They've done quite a lot to help create and promote the book. First, my publishers themselves, who are McGill Queen's University Press. They're represented this evening by Kate Fraser. Taking this book on was a bit of an act of faith because Coudenhove-Kalergi is relatively unknown in the English-speaking world, and I trust that they're now proud of their role in producing the book, as I am with the book that they published. Sorry, let me just run back one on that. Try if I can. And I wish to run back. Nonetheless, my second thanks. Share. I'm sorry, this is not. I'm running into a difficulty. One more. Let me leave it on the map there at the moment while I'm talking on this point. Then I have 3 other people I just briefly want to thank. Claudia Hamill, who's also in the audience, helped me immensely with the research and quite a lot of the editing on this book, which I'm fairly sure will not be half as good as I trust you find it will be when you read it. Professor Michael Shackleton is also there, who wrote the very first review for the Oasis website, and that has started to give it an echo in academic circles, where it's been, so far, I'm pleased to say, very well received. And finally, Brendan himself for inviting me onto this webinar, but also for posting the most insightful and astute review to date, which you'll find on the Trust website, because there he stresses both the contemporary and also the historical political relevance, strengths and weaknesses of the man. Now, without the help of all of those people, we wouldn't be here this evening to talk about Count Coudenhove-Kalergi, a forgotten father of Europe. I had on that listing the photo of the man himself. The Count, or RCK for short, in my shorthand speaking about him, began his political life not as a rival to Hitler publicly, but at exactly the same time as Hitler. Within a week of publishing his main publication, Hitler staged the Beer Hall Putsch in Munich. That makes the contemporaneity of these two people absolutely clear. They are both trying to solve in their very different ways the political situation that they meet after the end of the First World War and the results of the Versailles Treaty. The difficulty was, from Hitler's point of view, that Coudenhove-Kalergi was considerably more popular, more acceptable than Hitler himself was in those early days. Hitler's popularity only rose at the end of the 20s, whereas Coudenhove-Kalergi's had been right at the beginning. Indeed, Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, was selling so badly that his publisher refused to publish the third volume in 1928 because Coudenhove-Kalergi's works were outselling him, and volumes 1 and 2 were left on the stock, in the publisher's unsold stock. In Mein Kampf Volume 3, which didn't get published then, Hitler condemned Coudenhove as the Cosmopolitan Bastard, hence the title of the book, and the threat from this rival vision posed, the threat that it posed to the Nazi dream of German racial domination in Europe was what he devoted several pages of that book to. Now, this is the Europe of that time. This is Europe after the Versailles Treaty, with about a dozen new states across Central and Eastern Europe. As the empires fell, that principle of self-determination radically revised borders everywhere. The new Europe was a kaleidoscope of racial and linguistic conflicts that the League of Nations was very ill-equipped to either master or to pacify. RCK knew that this would lead to more wars, not to the peaceful continent that he and many, many other people after 1918 desperately wanted. This was his answer to the problem. In 1923, he published Paneuropa, October 23, as I say, just a week or so before the Beer Hall Putsch, and it became an instant political bestseller. It offered a blueprint for the United States of Europe, inspired by, if not actually modelled on, the USA. In little over a year, it sold 25,000 copies, which was big sales for the time, and the Count recruited 10,000 members to Paneuropa, his Europe-wide political movement. They came largely from the European intelligentsia, and I just quote a few names. Thomas and Heinrich Mann, Albert Einstein, and Sigmund Freud were all members of Paneuropa. He was befriended by the Rothschilds, financed by the Warburgs, rich Jewish bankers, and also Freemasons. In those circles, he found the sort of support he needed. If I go to the next click, I show you his idea for world peace. It was not just European peace, but world peace. If Europeans could get their act together and unite, the Count argued, then Paneuropa could take its place alongside other superpowers in the contemporary world. The USA had a sphere of influence that included Central and South America, away on the left. The Soviet Union stretched from the Baltic to the Bering Straits. China and Japan controlled the Far East, and Britain had its worldwide empire. If only the states of continental Europe would unite, they and their colonies, marked here in black, would become a fifth superpower. Together, these 5 superpowers would manage the peace of the world. Now, we all know that that did not happen. National rivalries in Europe led ultimately to the Second World War. The balance of power failed to keep the peace. Churchill, in opposition in the 1930s, grew ever more concerned with instability on the continent. The growth of nationalist totalitarian regimes in Italy, Hungary, Poland, Germany, Austria, and after a bitter civil war in Spain, pushed the democracies into the corner. The Count supported anti-Nazi regimes wherever he found them, and for that became a marked man in German eyes. He dramatically escaped the Gestapo in Vienna in 1938, came to London, met and advised Churchill, eventually fled across France during the Phoney War, and was finally spirited out of Lisbon to New York by American friends who were close to the nascent Office of Secret Services. He and his Jewish wife, the famous actress Ida Roland, flew in some luxury to America. The Yankee Clipper, shown here, was the latest in international air travel, taking 24 hours to cruise from Lisbon to New York. It was about 200 miles per hour and very low, but it was very comfortable. It went via the Canaries and Bermuda with small stopovers, and it had 5-star hotel service on board with sky-high prices to match. He couldn't afford it. People from America paid to get him out. Casablanca, known to everyone I know, once Coudenhove-Kalergi was in New York, he made a name for himself by promoting the cause of early American entry into the war in support of Great Britain, which was highly contested. He lobbied hard against the American First Movement, led by Charles Lindbergh, and served as a model for the suave and aristocratic Czech resistance hero in Casablanca, Victor Laszlo. He was travelling, incidentally, on a Czech diplomatic passport at the time. The next slide shows Murray Butler, the key American support for Coudenhove-Kalergi. He was chairman of the Carnegie Foundation for International Peace for many years, also president of Columbia University, as well as a prominent Freemason. He knew everyone in Washington and New York political elite. He was the contender himself for the Republican nomination as president and was a liberal-minded eminence grise for the East Coast establishment. He talent spotted the Count on an early trip to Europe in the early 20s and organised a lecture tour for him in the USA in 1925 to promote Paneuropa. His support opened doors and provided finance now for the war-torn refugee and his family in New York. This man is obviously President Truman, who in 1945 famously declared that the United States of Europe was, quote, an excellent idea. RCK's own views, especially his untiring anti-communism, gained the ear of the president and through him his Secretary of State George Marshall. RCK ensured that the massive post-war reconstruction program for Europe, Marshall Aid, was made conditional on European states cooperating with each other in preparing their reconstruction plans. Back in Europe, RCK again drew close to Churchill, who quoted him by name in his great Zurich speech in September 46, proposing himself a kind of United States of Europe. Here's the Grand Palace Hotel in Gstaad, near the Count's country house in Switzerland. RCK brought together a powerful network of integrationist MPs to support his policy of European integration in all the democratically elected parliaments on the continent. He called it the European Parliamentary Union, the EPU, and it demanded a European Parliament with the right to draft a European constitution. He went on to be the first speaker after Churchill in the Congress of Europe in May 1948 in The Hague. When the Treaty of London established the Council of Europe the following year, its Parliamentary Assembly, seen then as the first European Parliament, was attributed largely to the successful lobbying of RCK and his EPU. From the early 1920s, RCK had known about Jean Monnet, possibly had met, but that's uncertain, then Deputy Secretary General of the League of Nations. But it wasn't until Monnet drafted the Schuman Declaration in 1950 that their paths crossed again. For sure, RCK won the Charlemagne Prize that year, but Monnet set up a structure which echoed RCK's long-term aim of peaceful political union, but created a community method of small incremental steps along the road towards a distant goal. In contrast, the Count was concerned with big symbolic gestures that would underline a European identity. He created the European flag, was first to use Beethoven's Ode to Joy as the common anthem. He was the first to demand a common currency, even a common European passport and driving license. He and his wife declared themselves European patriots. Monnet's gradual accretion of common economic interests was a very different approach to the Count's grand geopolitical vision of a united Europe in a dangerous world. Charles de Gaulle is my next slide. Now, as British enthusiasm for a united Europe waned in the 1950s and 60s, after the Conservatives came back to power, so RCK turned towards the most powerful continental leader who would embody at least some of his European ideals, Charles de Gaulle. The president's aim might be a Europe of nation states rather than the federal Europe that RCK aspired to, but they both saw the need for strong leadership if Europe was ever to fulfill its potential in a brutally divided geopolitical world of the Cold War. They struck up what may appear at first sight an unlikely political friendship, but it was genuine and lasted until the president's death in 1970. 2 years later, the Count himself also died, aged 78, in a Kur hotel in Austrian Vorarlberg. His body was brought back to Gstaad and buried with a private ceremony in this small private cemetery today, nearby. It lies just a couple of 100 yards from the converted farmhouse he and his wife first used as their country home for many years. It was also very close to the linguistic border between France, the French-speaking and German-speaking cantons, in what he recognized as the best governed federal, or perhaps confederal, state in Europe. All Europe, the Count once prophesied, would one day be as rich as America and as peaceful as Switzerland, if only it would unite. On his gravestone is inscribed his pithy epigraph, "Pioneer of the United States of Europe." That's now where my stop share. That's where my screen sharing comes to an end. I hope I've given a turbulent time of the 20th century, living through coming of age in the First World War and dying the very year in which Britain, in fact, joined the common market. So that's the span of his life, and he put his mark on it. I think he's worth looking at again, and I think many of the ideas that he pursued, in particular this stress on identity, are coming back right into vogue. We are all in a big debate about European identity, and the European Union, which has grown much more strongly from the roots laid down by Monnet, using the method that Monnet introduced, is facing, it would be an exaggeration to say too critical a stage, but it is a serious stage, where it's being asked to grasp big issues of defence, which aren't solvable by small minor steps. They are big leaps. They are more like the leaps of faith, perhaps, of vision, certainly, that Coudenhove proposed. Brendan.
Well, thank you very much indeed. You've set the terms of our debate and discussion very nicely. If people want to offer questions or comments, there's the Q&A function on your screen, and I hope a lot of people, I know there are many expert people in the audience, will chime in. There are a couple of questions I'd like to ask, if I may. One, can you say a bit more about the influence and how this influence was brought to bear by Coudenhove-Kalergi in the 1930s? You mentioned impressive names, but I think there were congresses, I think there was quite a lot of publicity work. Can you say a bit more about how that worked? Because obviously at the beginning of the 1920s, he was unknown. By 1940, he was something of a rock superstar of European integration. How did that come about? And the second question is perhaps a more philosophical one. It seemed to me that the reason why the Monnet method has prevailed up till now is that it has quite a good idea of how to get from where we are now to where we want to be. How would you defend Coudenhove-Kalergi against the claim that he had a nice idea about where we wanted to be, but he didn't know how to get there? So if you could answer those two questions, I'm sure lots of others will follow.
Yes, sure, with pleasure. The 1930s, well, obviously the 1930s are marked by the watershed of early 1933, when the Nazis seized power in Germany. Germany was the main country in which his Paneuropa Union was active. That's to say, the biggest membership was in Germany. After all, it was the biggest state, or the biggest, most populated state, and that was shut down immediately by the Nazis. Its assets were seized, people were, many of them interrogated, one or two were imprisoned, and the whole structure fell apart. Ironically, he was lecturing to a private dinner club of senior Germans, people in the political swim in Berlin, on the very night that Hitler called his first cabinet together, the day before assuming power. And that, if you like, was the swan song of Paneuropa, that final lecture. Coudenhove knew that very well. He had to fall back on Vienna and work from Vienna, which was where he'd started the whole operation. And throughout the Nazi years, up to the war, he was working up to 38, he was working from Vienna, very closely with Dollfuss initially, and then with Schuschnigg, the two chancellors of the time. Dollfuss was only, in fact, chancellor for a little over a year before he was assassinated by the Nazis in Vienna. And Schuschnigg, as you know, was forced to rescind the planned plebiscite under the threat of annexation, and the annexation took place anyway. How he managed then, and how he kept a high profile, if you like, for Paneuropa without Germany, was by organizing a large number of very practical conferences on innumerable themes which were of interest to the states which could already see themselves as potential victims of an enlarging Germany. So from Vienna, he would bring in, if you like, as an extension of Dollfuss and Schuschnigg's foreign policy, as many states of the Danube Basin as possible to discuss common transport concerns, common agrarian concerns, common social concerns, even common educational concerns. It was like having a council of ministers on all these separate issues, largely populated by ministers from Central and Eastern Europe. And he was holding several of these conferences a year, all as a private initiative, backed by the Austrian government. He had offices right next door to the Chancellor, in fact, which were taken over by Seyss-Inquart afterwards when the Nazis took over and used as his private residence. But he was there, lodged in the Hofburg, very centrally for the Austrians, and inevitably went down with Austria in 1938. Then he was traveling around any countries unsympathetic to Germany. That essentially meant the Netherlands, Belgium, Britain, Paris, France, trying to persuade people in power to be more coherent, to put themselves together rather than respond separately to the rising Nazi menace, to use the classic term. He was wanted by the Gestapo. He escaped by the skin of his teeth in March 1938 with his wife. On the way over the border, incidentally, picking up the widow of Dollfuss in an adjacent car, and then with the support of Mussolini, who was still anti-Nazi at that time, he wanted an independent Austria, being escorted across northern Italy, given safe passage to get him to Switzerland, and Dollfuss's widow, who subsequently came to Britain, stayed in Wales, found it too wet, and was whisked off eventually, I believe, to America. Anyway, that's part of the story.
That's the 1930s, and then the more philosophical question that I put, that Coudenhove-Kalergi didn't really have an idea how to get to where he wanted to be.
Well, his route to getting somewhere was capturing the commanding heights, not the commanding heights of the economy, but the commanding heights of the political parties. He had a fantastic visiting book, if you like. He knew everyone who was a senior politician across the whole of Europe in the mainstream parties, the non-extremist parties. He had no truck with the communists at all, and he had no truck with nationalists. That's obvious. But anyone who was a liberal or possibly a social democrat, the notion was emerging of social democracy, but they were generally labeled socialist, and they tried to distinguish themselves from being communist, or anyone who was conservative was welcome to try and make their foreign policies the policy of Paneuropa. He once said that if everyone had Paneuropa as its foreign policy, I would have achieved my goal. It was a persuasion job that he was in. And when he held his big conferences, he said, we're not here to discuss whether there should be a Paneuropa. We're here to discuss how to persuade people to have Paneuropa.
Good. Well, we have a couple of questions. I'll read them out. I may have some other questions later on, but thanks very much for that. One from Claudia Hamill. Can you tell us a little more about RCK's work brokering reconciliation between French and German MPs after the Second World War, and also his link with the Council of Europe? is there a role now for developing bilateral links between the UK and other European MPs?
So, sure, with pleasure. He did have a very, very interesting and I think influential role in getting leading people to meet between France and Germany. And it was still when Germany didn't yet have nationally elected parliamentarians, or just at the time when they were being nationally elected. He had conceived the idea that French and German members of parliament ought to talk to each other outside of Bonn and outside of Paris. It couldn't be a formal operation. In fact, so many of his initiatives were indeed very private. They were like the sector of society. It was a civil society initiative, if we put it in modern terms. And so he invited, I think it was 70 or 80 MPs from Germany and France on 2 occasions in 49, I think it's as early as that, to meetings in Switzerland, very close to the border, not far from Basel, where basically they were get-to-know-you meetings, because who knew who the new MPs were in Germany? Nobody did. Even the new ones in France were changing rather rapidly in France, election after election. But it was his way of getting people to know and understand each other's problems and find common ground. And to be the first person to have done that is quite an achievement, actually, quite an achievement. I mean, if he'd only done that, he would be a small footnote in history. As it is, he did so much more than that is a darn sight more than a footnote in history. He's a major figure who has been overlooked in our part of the world, but nonetheless not overlooked in France or Germany by any means at all. I'm sorry, that was the first part of the question.
Yes, the Council of Europe, bilateral links between the UK and other European MPs.
Yeah. Certainly for the Council of Europe, he wasn't obviously part of the negotiation of the Treaty of London. He was never a national civil servant. He was never a national politician. This is a man who comes from the private sector with private backing. And what he did, he felt his role was to be the man who could persuade other people to do the right thing. If I make the analogy won't go very far, but think of George Soros. Soros isn't a national politician. Soros isn't an official, but Soros goes around. Soros and his whole movement now has been set up as a civil society initiative to do the right thing about liberal democracy, particularly in Europe. And it's not all that different to what he was doing. I think Soros's money is probably a lot more secure than the money sources for Coudenhove-Kalergi, which went up and down quite considerably during his lifetime. But the notion and the initiative is to change things from outside the existing structures in favour of a structure which is much better than the one we've got. Hence, pushing down national representation and raising joint representation. Hence, the Council of Europe, which came out of the Treaty of London, was seen as the result of the efforts of his European Parliamentary Union MPs, all of whom followed this same activity, this same aim that he was encouraging within their parliaments. They formed pressure groups within parliaments and leant upon sometimes a governing party, sometimes an opposition party, sometimes both, in order to encourage them down this road. And so there was public recognition. Indeed, one of Churchill's son-in-law,
Duncan Sands
wrote to him, now whether this was tongue-in-cheek or not, but wrote to him to congratulate him on the achievement of the Parliamentary Assembly in the Council of Europe, which he saw as his work. Now, you don't get that for nothing, even if it was slightly tongue-in-cheek, because Duncan Sands was not in any way favour. He wanted, in a sense, to play this role as a politician. He wanted to play the role from a British point of view, leading the debate of Europe through Churchill, making his major contribution there. And he saw Coudenhove-Kalergi very largely as a rival for Churchill's ear. For 2 or 3 or 4 years, that was the case. Only later did that fall away when he came back into power in Britain with Churchill and was given a government post, and no longer did the European issue loom large for him. I think things got a little bit easier.
And then finally, the question of parliamentary links between the UK outside the European Union and MPs in member states of the European Union.
Well, specifically, Coudenhove's experience in putting parliaments together really rests on what he did for the French and German parliaments, this private initiative with the meetings in Switzerland. He was obviously pleased to see the Parliamentary Assembly in place. That was very much seen as I say, the first European Parliament. But Paul Henry Spark, then the story really is Paul Henry Spark's story. For better part of 2 years, Spark tried to make this work as a constituent assembly, and it couldn't, because the drafting of the Treaty of London had only given it advisory powers. It was like later, the first draft of the European Parliament was given only advisory status, and it couldn't do what Coudenhove wanted it to do and what Spark wanted it to do as well. And so Spark shifted from playing a major role in the Council of Europe, the sort of role that Coudenhove wanted him to play, to throwing his weight behind really the formation of the European Union.
And of course, the European.
So I don't think, sorry, the British bit, whether the Brits can now, oh dear, whether the Brits can revamp through the Council of Europe a series of bilateral links. I mean, if the Brits and the bilateral and the parliamentarians on the other side were looking for the same thing, it would be wonderful. But I look around, not quite in despair, but I look around with little confidence at the courage of Brits to stand up and say where we should really be, and go about how to do it. And that courage is lacking in Parliament, as it's lacking largely in public.
We've got some very good questions. So I think I'll just read through them and take them one by one, because each of them, I suspect will provoke quite a long answer. Yadvisvan would like to know if you could, send his greetings. Can you elaborate a bit more on the differences of approach with regard to European integration between CoudenhoveKalergi and Jean Monnet, Robert Schuman? I think you've hinted at it, but perhaps a slightly fuller answer would help the audience.
Yes. Well, there's a chapter in the book totally dedicated to his relations to Monnet, and there I go through the period where this was useful, from 50 to 70s, based on sometimes correspondence between the two, sometimes a strange correspondence where Coudenhove is asking if Monnet is available for a meeting, and Monnet is avoiding the prospect because Monnet doesn't like, Monnet's ideal really is a Europe by stealth. It's what we've got. It's Europe by little steps. By stealth is giving it a rather slant.
Yes, that's quite different to incremental, isn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, is it stealth or is it incremental? It is incremental, but the incremental is that you're not meant to know. Well, you're not. Is it the purpose that you're not meant to notice that we are uniting in a way? No, it's not the purpose, because the goal is always political union. And here's where Coudenhove scores his trump in relations with Monnet. He says, we both have got the goal of the United States of Europe as our goal. In fact, Monnet even sets up his pressure group as a pressure group for the United States of Europe. Well, that's what Coudenhove's been asking for the last 30 years. So they're both, their goal is the same, but the method of reaching it is radically different. And Monnet has much more of the partly the politician sense, but certainly an awareness of civil services. And he knows that you shouldn't frighten the horses. It was a miracle to get the declaration agreed on the sixth sign. And that was big enough. And now you must only do things shortly. And it was a wider experience too. I mean, the EDC, the defence community, fell. That was the next big attempt. The economy had been attempted with coal and steel, then defence was attempted, and then it became the common market, but with different range of powers, and the ECSC and the common market treaties obviously are not the same thing. The institutions have slightly different roles and different powers, and in a nutshell, the common thrust is weakened as you move from the coal and steel to the common market, but the basis for common effort is widened. There.
Two similar questions. one from Sharon Pardo. Can you please tell us about RCK's support of European colonialism? And then from Stefan Hayel, sorry for the pronunciation, did he take it for granted that Europe ought to be a big power? On what did he base that? Is there an element of superior thinking, of looking down on other people in this idea that Europe is some way superior to other parts of the world?
Oh yes, the answer is yes in both cases. Certainly, I mean, he's a colonialist. He's a man of his time. And this man was born in 1894. He's born into an aristocratic family. He is in fact half Japanese and half Austrian. He's part of the ruling elite, or he grows up in a family which is part of the ruling elite of a vast empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it collapses around him while he's a student. And he's looking for an alternative, and his alternative is not rebuilding another empire, but making Europe peaceful, because the empires fall because European empires fought each other. And you might wonder why he thinks Europe's important. Nothing else much was, except Russia after the revolution, and that was still doubtful. It didn't happen until during the war. And America, that came in with some forces which settled the balance in 1918. When you talked about, well, they didn't talk about superpowers, but we can look back and say, well, that's the beginning, effectively, of the rise of the two big superpowers and their concern for Europe. In that picture, Coudenhove is saying, whoops, get out from under. We don't want to be communist, and we don't want to be capitalist with a big C. What we want is a European peaceful settlement. And getting out from under took with it all the colonies of everyone who was involved, and that was quite clear. The map, as I showed you the basically the left-hand half of Africa, where the French were strongest, and the Portuguese. That would all be conceived as part of Paneuropa, just as the British Empire was Britain and its empire. That was accepted. There was no real question in Coudenhove's mind that was the reality with which he was dealing, and he wasn't questioning whether it was right or wrong. That was it. You just had to have it. And at one stage he was trying to find ways, as Britain, as manifestly the situation changed, let's say during the Second World War, and the British Empire was not going to be anymore, it was quite clear that Britain could be in the European game and not standing outside the continental game. He had always wanted it in because he could see that Britain and the continent together with their empires would be by far the biggest of the three big powers, way out marching Russia or even America. But that was never really on the cards. In fact, the Pan-European movement passed various resolutions in which they always were saying, and Britain if it wishes to join, and Britain with Britain if we can, but never against Britain. With Britain, but never against Britain. And we're back in a funny way after Brexit with the continental union and Britain outside.
Well, that ties in nicely with another question from David Gow. One of which is a historical answer and the other of which is a speculative answer. Did he share de Gaulle's view that the United Kingdom should not become a member of the European Union or the European Community as it was there in the 1960s, which I seem to remember the answer is yes, reluctantly. But just as interestingly, would he welcome the UK's self-expulsion from the EU if he were alive today?
Well, there's a lovely factual answer to this. He agreed with the president at the first no, and he disagreed for the second and wrote to him saying that you're wrong about the second one. The way things are going, it's going to have to be Britain in. And in any case, Britain is no longer the Britain. He doesn't say this explicitly, but this is, I think, an understanding of what he meant. The Britain that you're trying to keep out isn't the Britain that was being nasty to you. That for personal reasons you have a dislike of the Anglosphere, which come from your wartime experience, but that's not an objective judgment about what happened in the war. That's about your subjective feel about the war. And between the first no and the second no, Coudenhove changes his advice. It's interesting.
And was that to do with the Labour government? Did he think that the Labour government of mid-1960s was a different beast from the Conservatives who had originally approached the Europe?
I don't think so. No, I don't think so. I think I don't recall any element of the research that spoke about him making that distinction. I think what he does do is he sees that Britain is no longer a triumphant colonial power. Okay, it's not a power in that sense. It still is a power in other senses, but it is a weakening power, not a rising. It's a falling, not a rising power. Even in the 60s, he sees that. And he doesn't see, apart from Heath, whom he is a strong supporter of, he doesn't see, I think, any other named figure than Macmillan, perhaps, he mentions, but I don't remember him naming another figure as being a strong leader in Britain. And he is very attractive to strong leaders. This is a hangover, if you like, from trying to master the commanding heights of the political structures in the 20s and 30s. He wants strong leaders to get a grip of Europe and do something with it, not F around, unable to achieve the goal he wants them to achieve.
You talked about contacts with Heath personally and Macmillan possibly. Somebody's asked David Woodhead, sorry not to have mentioned your name, David, but you get a credit now. Did Coudenhove-Kalergi have contact with the governments of Macmillan and Heath when they were trying to achieve and actually achieving UK entry to the European Economic Community?
Yeah, this man has a highly personalized approach to the notion of power and the notion of influence. He writes direct to the Prime Minister, whether he knows him or not. In most cases, he does know, and he's met them on some social circuit, or I don't know, at the prize givings of the Prix-Charlemagne, or wherever he happens to have been on circuit, visiting Adenauer or whatever. And he just writes direct. When he writes encouraging Britain and Italy to join the Élysée Pact, for instance, he writes directly, I think it's to Colombo, and I can't remember who the Prime Minister was at the time, probably Macmillan. Not sure. But he writes straight to the head of government, simple as that. Count Coudenhove-Kalergi, signed at the bottom of the page, and gets a reply. These people know him, they recognize, they know the history, they know that he's close to the goal. It's tremendous. It's tremendous as a personalized network through which he exercises a very personalized, if you like, a very unaccountable power. There's nothing very democratic about the way this man works. He works through key people. He wants in his very early writings, which are as much philosophical as political, he wants Plato's solution to the Republic. He wants the guardians to take the decisions, and he expects to be among the guardians, as simple as that. The intelligentsia ought to have a separate chamber in order to keep the mass vote reasonably tempered and in control. Democracy isn't simply an ignorant vote is as good as an intelligent vote, or even as a wise vote. And okay, maybe when we see Brexit go the wrong way, we don't all agree that one vote is equal to one vote. We have to buy it sometimes, but it's pretty bitter. Yep.
David rightly says that you didn't answer his hypothetical question about whether RKC today, were he alive today, would have welcomed Brexit after the experiences of 1973 to 2016.
Well, I think this is highly speculative. He's died just before we joined, but I think he would, and he did. He welcomed Britain joining. That was very good news for him, very good indeed, because then he felt there could be four leaders running the show. It would be Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, and we're still talking about Western Europe, by the way, not the whole of Europe, but nonetheless that would be the picture, and that would have been the heart of a strong Europe. And he would have welcomed that, but he would, I think, have been amazed looking at, for instance, the debate on the constitutional, on the future of Europe at the moment. It's got something like 15 or 20 priority topics to deal with. And they're not, I believe, put in any hierarchy. And he would have said, well, can't you see the wood for the trees? What matters is that we are all European and we have some central way of expressing European opinion. And that is our political responsibility. One or other small policy is not going to make Europe, however many small steps you take along it, until you have, let's say, a common transport policy. That doesn't make Europe. Europe is made on the big issues of, do we accept that there will be institutions which run a federal or a quasi-federal state? That will we grasp the nettle and say that the big issues of sovereignty are that it must be shared, and it must be shared in a meaningful way. You can't do it through this sectoral approach. You've got to have the big stuff, and the big stuff may include a sector like defence, because that's a life and death issue. It might be foreign relations, because you have to speak with a single voice in the world. But there are only a few where the sectoral element is intrinsic to the essence of what you're about, which is political union.
You still haven't answered about whether he would have welcomed Brexit or not.
I don't know why he would have wanted. I don't know why he would have welcomed Brexit. I mean, it would have meant that if you like, he was the Brits have encouraged that. Well, yeah. Let me put it this way: the Brits, by following Brexit, have encouraged the Continentals to go further and faster, because we've been a brake on that process. That's quite clear. Now, whether he would, in the circumstances after 40 odd years of us being a brake and the nature of the EU now, would have thought that the Continentals really can make a go of it and will grasp the nettle and will share sovereignty meaningfully, it's a different world. We've got a reunited Germany, we've got an extended Eastern Europe. We're back to the story of 1918, and that story required Britain in to balance. And I think that he would be very worried to see a Europe that might be really centered on one strong nation, not totally, obviously not, but where there is one nation that has by far the strongest voice, as opposed to 4 or 5 that shared strong voices. That's, I think, where he would regret Brexit.
David Lennon has asked about the private backers. Can you review the private backers? Did they change over time? Were they different before or after the Second World War? Nationalities, social background?
Yes, they did. And he had his ups and downs, times when there was plenty of money coming in and times when there wasn't. Part of the time he had subscription money coming from the members of this Paneuropa during the 20s and 30s. He had the backing of the Austrian government, obviously, in the 30s up till 38. He was on his beam uppers in America because he had to get a teaching post in New York University to make ends meet, really. I mean, he would have been supported, but not supported lavishly at all. And he was struggling to get a mixture of public and private money when he was back in Europe. The biggest upset, his early backers, I mean, obviously helped him. It was Jewish and Freemason helps, financial help in the 20s, one could say. I mean, by the end of the 20s, I think that was fading. But a number of governments did row in from Eastern Europe with small donations during the time when he was working from Austria. That helped keep things up. Romania also, in particular, was helping, and the Czech Republic. But the biggest blow that he had was when the European movement, which obviously was Churchill's effort to bring together all the pro-European movements after 1945, went looking for American money, because there was obviously a lot more American money around at the time than not. And Coudenhove-Kalergi had already been there. He got a support group in America during the war for Paneuropa, and he kept that going after the war, and he was getting money from American sources. And Churchill was a much bigger name and obviously displaced him in America in getting money. So the OSS money from the Office of Secret Services, which flowed eventually through the CIA, went to the European movement. It didn't go to Paneuropa. And there was a period during the 1950s where he was very sore about having lost this. And he said very clearly in a letter back to Wild Bill Donovan, who ran the OSS then, he said, what you've done is to give money to a movement which is not convinced of a federal future for Europe. Mine is, and that's the one that you just cut the branch.
One of the things often mentioned on the right of the British political spectrum is fear of a European superstate. Mm-hmm. Is Coudenhove-Kalergi one of their prime witnesses in favour of that?
Well, it depends what you mean by superstate. If you mean a superstate looking outwards, yes, he wants Europe to be a superpower, outward looking, playing a role in the world commensurate with its strengths, be that economic, political, military, or whatever. But if you mean superstate spying on everyone inside and controlling, he really wasn't interested. I mean, that wasn't an issue. By the time he died in 1972, the notion of, if you like, the conflict of states was between totalitarian, where they did spy inside, that's Russia, okay, a controlled state, and the free, quote, free West, which was capitalist, anti-totalitarian. And he was absolutely clear it's about anti-totalitarian. And the most important book he wrote on that topic is written in 1939 and published in London, which is The Totalitarian State Against Man. And it's welcomed by a reviewer there, one of Churchill's closest aides, and then again the name escapes me just for a moment, but it's in a review in the Evening Standard of all places, which was then a very, very respectable paper and would carry serious reviews of serious books, as being the philosophy that all honest men have been looking for, neither of the left nor of the right. So, oh yeah.
A couple of things I'd like to ask, one of which really follows from that last remark of yours. You said that Coudenhove-Kalergi wanted a Europe that certainly wasn't communist, but that wasn't unrestrainedly capitalist either. How far do you think that different interpretation of what appropriate level of capitalism might be for Western democracy, how far was that a question, do you think, in Brexit and the alienation of the Conservative Party in particular from the European Union? And now that we've decided that we're all in favour of levelling up and business is the enemy, will that make it easier for us to rejoin, perhaps?
Well, yes, what a what-if question. His critique of capitalism sprang from the 1920s, and it's quite explicit and quite clear. He wants a state that's ruled by an intelligent, an intellectual class, the intelligentsia, crudely. Hiller was the man in Germany whose group he belonged to, and this was their philosophy. Hiller's a very, very interesting figure of the time, much underrepresented. Maybe I got to write a book about him. But the argument is that if you open the door entirely to capitalism, as opposed to the communist system taking in as extreme alternatives, you open the door to the lowest common denominator in all fields. Everything will be bought for money. And if it makes everybody a consumer, then you'll get consumerism. If you want to keep a dumb populace, you will have capitalist media, because you can keep the populace dumb. The manipulative element of capitalism is the bad element. Excessive consumerism and a dumbing down of the populace was not what he wanted. He wanted, if you like, for his time, he wanted a more honest, more centrist government, if you could get it. It led him, of course, to inevitably to side with those who weren't communists, because there was no way back from the one-party state already established in Russia, whereas at least the others tolerated various parties, even if most of the parties pursued a similar capitalist line. But whether that would make it easier to get back out from Brexit, I really don't know that there's closely.
It was a slightly tongue-in-cheek question.
Yeah, fine.
And the final question that I've got, and I think nobody else has got any, does refer to something you've talked about several times, the rather elitist nature of his views, which in some cases lapped over into support of authoritarian figures. You mentioned Dollfuss, wasn't Chancellor for very long, but he's not somebody that everybody would regard as a happy association. Lots of people in the 1930s who were not on the left of the political spectrum had conflicted views more about Mussolini than Hitler. But Coudenhove-Kalergi, you hint in the book, I think you suggest, reposed hopes in Mussolini rather longer than other people did, perhaps longer than was historically looking back wise. How would you assess his attraction, as some would see it, for authoritarian individual figures, not merely authoritarian or quasi-authoritarian elitist modes of government, but was there not, frankly, an unhealthy element of attraction to authoritarian figures in him?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I don't think he hero worshipped any of them. I mean, not even Churchill, to whom he really had immense respect. He did write to Churchill once to say, "You've made me the happiest man in the world," when Churchill quoted his name in the Zurich speech as saying what we owe to Coudenhove-Kalergi and his Paneuropa movement. And now that's fantastic praise, and it's fantastic gesture back to say, "You've made me the happiest man in the world" by mentioning that. But what he saw in strong men was that strong men could get things done. That's what it was about. If Mussolini is the man who will keep Italy in, or in for many years, will keep Austria independent of Germany, that's the key foreign policy issue from his point of view. Austria must not be absorbed by Germany, because that ruins any notion of balance. Then after that, and he foresaw it and wrote about this before it happened, if Austria goes, Czechoslovakia goes. If Czechoslovakia goes, then the Germans will be, I don't know, the oil fields of Romania. So he can see this and says it very clearly in his writings, which are often very prophetic. But he makes use of strong men when he can to bolster his view that we want a settlement which is acceptable to all the member states, as it were. It's in a funny way, that's what we're doing in the Council of Ministers every day. We want solutions acceptable to all the member states. And when one becomes an overweening strong state, it's harder. It gets harder, not easier. But he wanted, as you say, his association for the times was quite understandable. Mussolini seemed so much better than Hitler. I mean, there are many people in Britain were courting Mussolini right up to 1939. So, sorry,
Yeah. Well,
not clear.
Just finally, a new question that's come in. David Woodhead said that in the referendum of 2016, he had to defend against UKIP attack Coudenhove-Kalergi. Is your book in any sense an attempt to revivify, to clear his reputation, because he is something of a bogeyman for UKIP, more scholarly part of UKIP, if that's not a contradiction in terms?
Well, I do think it is a contradiction in terms, to be fair, but I think the critique from the right, really from the really loony right, the very far right, the critique is a critique that he was in favour of miscegenation. He wanted the races to mix so that they would be more easily led by the intelligentsia that he thought would lead them. That's a view from the 1920s. Now, it's way out of date, and all the language is horrendous to woke generation, obviously. But the whole notion it's on one statement in one of his essays to that effect, that the far right has built up this great Kalergi plan on the displacement theory, and I mean, quite extraordinarily, maligning the man. And if anything rescues him from that, it's worthwhile. But I didn't write this book to do that. I mean, I wanted this name of someone who has been important in European history not to be forgotten in the English-speaking part of the world, notably in the UK, when he is so well known on the continent. As I say at one point at the end, streets and squares are named after him. He's been in school syllabus, he's been in the university syllabus, theses are written about him. Other people can write continental biographies of him. No one's looked at him in England, and no one talks about him in England, except this loony right.
Well, I was going to suggest that I think it's a bit more deeply entrenched in UKIP than just the loony right. I think he is a name that is mentioned in any very exaggerated context, but not just on the loony right. He's the forefather of the superstate. He's somebody who precisely wanted to do what you talked about, which was stealthily to build up the power of the European institutions. And that is a critique of him which comes from UKIP and from the right of the Conservative Party as well. And his name is mentioned in that connection.
Well, I would counter that strongly. I don't think there's anything stealthy about this man. He's I'm going to say, crystal clear. I mean, he writes immensely amount. I mean, he wrote 31 books, and they're almost all around this subject. So there's quite a lot to read. 2 or 3 of them he actually wrote in English too, which is it's just accessible. It's good English, and given the historical allowances you have to make for when they were published, I mean, they can give you an idea of his thinking. But Paneuropa is available in translation, was translated in 1926, and it's crystal clear. There's nothing stealthy about this man at all. On the contrary, he would argue that Jean Monnet, who is forever telling him, don't have another big Congress, please, let things happen, but don't have 1,000 or 2,000 MPs crying for a united Europe, because that will frighten the horses. And that's what Coudenhove wants. He wants us to understand that it is serious, it is big, and the step has to be taken sometime. Well, what are the alternatives? Well, the alternatives will change as time goes on, but the alternatives, they're different now because the Russian Empire is smaller than it was from 1945 on. It's back roughly where it was back in 1919. But the arguments in essence are the same. The facts around them differ historically.
Well, thank you very much. I was slightly ruefully amused by your reluctance to speculate about what Coudenhove-Kalergi might have thought about Brexit. But I was reminded of a canvassing episode when I once knocked on somebody's door, and the lady told me that she always followed her husband, who was very pro-European. And I hoped that would enable me to garner her political support. She said, well, I'm not sure. I think he might have changed his mind since he died. So some people have confidence in working out what the dead might have said. I think you're very wise to be a bit more cautious. But thank you very much indeed. That was a marvelous evening, and it covered philosophy and history and biography and social commentary in a way that I thought was quite remarkable. So thank you very much. And the final lesson, of course, is anyone who hasn't read the book certainly ought to read it for one of these reasons or all of these reasons as soon as they possibly can. We have another Federal Trust event on the 12th, which will be about environmental questions, and I hope many of you will be there too. Thank you very much, Martyn, and good night to you all.
Thank you.